God morgon och tack för att ni lyssnar på engelska. Min svenska är inte så bra. Hälsningar från Exeter. Thank you. That's the bit I was most anxious about. But I do appreciate the fact that you are all listening to me in your second language, and I can go anywhere and people speak English. So for me, it just seems worth saying. It's also worth letting you know where Exeter is, because when people think about England, very few people know where Exeter is. So what I'm hoping to do this morning is to spend the first half, perhaps a third to a half of the lecture talking about the issue of grammar and how we've historically, traditionally thought about grammar, and trying to change the way we think about it for a more constructive way of working with learners in the classroom. And then I've got some very practical examples of what that means, where I'm likely to be asking you to talk to each other at those points about questions that I have on the slides. So there will be a little bit of interaction, but I won't be taking feedback. So just pausing to think a little bit about what you might call the grammar problem. In some ways, the fact that I'm having to talk about rethinking it or reframing it flags that perhaps there is an issue with the word grammar and what we think about grammar. And so what I'm really interested in is thinking through this idea of what is the place of grammar in the teaching of literacy and in the learning of literacy. And if we look back, and even if we look around the world currently, there's a considerable amount of disagreement and divergence in terms of the kind of value there is placed on grammar in the literacy or the language learning curriculum. Now, for people like me coming from an Anglophone background, largely the teaching of grammar was abandoned in the 60s, 70s, 80s, following a major conference in America, the Dartmouth Conference, which effectively decided there was no point teaching grammar because it didn't make any difference to students' language use. Now, when I say largely abandoned, it didn't mean that it was never taught, but it was never advocated in the curriculum, and many teachers chose not to teach it. And now, in England, where we have a huge emphasis on grammar in the curriculum, not necessarily for the right reasons, we have two generations of teachers who themselves don't know much grammar because they weren't taught it themselves. But that picture, that Anglophone picture, is not a universal issue. So Far Eastern and Middle Eastern countries routinely teach grammar as part of their mother tongue and second language teaching. Europe is more varied, so many European countries do still teach grammar, but I know that there's variety in the degree of commitment there is to that teaching. And from previous visits to Sweden, I know that grammar is there in your curriculum, but that there's not necessarily great enthusiasm from all teachers for teaching it. So for me, the real question I want to look at in this first part of this lecture is, what is the place of grammar, if there is one, in that literacy classroom? And if we look at why some of those views might have arisen, part of the problem is the research base underpinning this. Research about how much grammar helps language learners has strongly and repeatedly over time argued that it's not much good. It doesn't do much worth. That is largely, again, research in an Anglophone tradition, but you can see the dates there that time after time there are researchers saying when you look at the evidence base, there is no evidence of any efficacy for the teaching of grammar. One of my concerns about this is that actually they're all referring to the same set of studies largely. They just keep repeating it over time. But here are some of the things that they say about grammar teaching. That it has a harmful effect on the development of original writing. that there's a negative effect for the explicit and systematic teaching of the parts of speech and the structure of sentences. And then one of the ones that's quoted most often, nothing helps your writing so much as ignoring grammar. And I think it's important to recognise that base, and I want to develop some of those ideas as we go forward, because our own research, we have come up with large randomised controlled trial evidence of the efficacy of teaching grammar. So we've got research evidence that does, I think, contradict that history. But let's just think a little bit more about that. If we move to the second language context, which I know is the context that most of you are thinking about it, there is a long tradition of teaching grammar as one of the key ways into learning a foreign language or a second language. And for me, learning French and German in the 70s in England, it was dominantly through learning grammar. We did do audiolingual approaches, and we did occasionally, very occasionally, do role plays where we used the language, but mostly it was a very repetitive pattern of learning the present tense of to be and to have, and then the present tense of certain groups of verbs, and so it was very grammar driven, and we made notes on our grammar. But that approach has been largely overtaken by the communicative language teaching approach, which kind of dispenses with the need for grammar and focuses much more on authentic context for having conversations in the target language. And of course, it promoted using the target language in the classroom and the avoidance of that explicit grammar, largely for the same reasons as the Anglophone rejection of grammar, that was there any evidence that an explicit attention to grammar would help them to be any better when they try to communicate in the second language. But again, I don't know where things stand currently in Sweden, but if you look internationally, the communicative language teaching approach is now being heavily critiqued. Partly because of that idea of authenticity, that a classroom can only ever be authentic as a classroom. It can only pretend to be authentic in other contexts. But much more because the absence of grammar actually has been seen to sometimes hinder the way in which children communicate, because they haven't got a way into thinking about the language. And I think that there are issues there around what is the place for grammar in a second language curriculum as well as the first language. And what we have is a tension between two different approaches, which in some ways are very opposite, very binary, where one focuses on grammatical form and the other focuses on meaningful communication. And the main argument I want to make today is that actually that tension can be resolved if you actually see grammar as a way into thinking about meaningful communication rather than something which is separate from meaningful communication. So if we were to think about what is the place of grammar in literacy, one argument might be, as Hauserman has said from a US perspective, that actually grammar is a broken subject. And it talks about grammar is often ignored, broken off from the teaching of literature, rhetoric, drama, composition, and creative writing. And grammar is the skunk at the garden party of the language arts. I love that. Grammar is the skunk. The funny thing is, I was trying to find some images for skunks to put on the screen. And when you do Google images, all the pictures of skunks are of beautiful little creatures. So I had to not put those on because they would distort the message. So I want to continue to explore this a little more. I think I've talked already about that tension between a focus on grammar as form and a focus on language learning as meaningful communication, and my view that those two are not opposites but can be brought together. But the other main reason why grammar has been rejected is because of the notion that grammar is really about rules and about how you must use language and about learning accurate ways of saying things and about being correct. There's a lot of reference to this as talking about the grammar police. And I don't know how, you probably don't know anything about strange Victorian opera singers, opera composers in the UK, but Gilbert and Sullivan wrote a very famous song called "I Am the Very Model of a Modern Major General." And this is a skit on it, which talks about being I am the very model of an amateur grammarian. And if you look at what it's saying, it's all about the role of a grammarian or grammar teacher is to make sure that none of the infelicities and sins of language use are committed in that classroom. And there's a sort of strong overtone between accuracy in language use and moral standards. In fact, in England, there's considerable evidence that you very quickly move from thinking about grammar as complying with language rules to grammar as complying with social rules. We had major riots in London in 2011, really just caused by social tension and poverty and class divisions. And it was reported that if only those young people had known how to speak properly, there wouldn't have been any riots, which kind of summarizes how quickly that grammar debate becomes not about language learning, but actually about social class and social division. So, taking that a little bit further, what then is the place of grammar in literacy teaching? What's underpinning this really are major questions about, well, why do we teach grammar? And that might be a question that you just reflect on from your point of view. If you teach grammar, why do you teach grammar? What do you think it does for your language learners? And there are a set of questions that you could use to frame that thinking. One might be, do we teach grammar so that learners can identify nouns and verbs, etc.? So is it about labelling and identifying the meta-language? Do we teach grammar so that learners understand the structure of their own and other languages? Do we teach grammar so that learners will not make mistakes in their writing or speaking? Or do we teach grammar so that learners can understand how text and language works in communicating meaning? If I'm doing this in England with English teachers, there's a fifth question, which is, do we teach grammar so that children can do the grammar test? Because we have an abhorrence in the UK. Children at age 7 and 11 do a spelling, punctuation and grammar test, which is supposed to be a proxy for judging their writing. And it's all about rules and correctness. And the truth is, for many primary teachers in the UK, the reason they teach grammar is because of that. They have to. And that's not the best reason for teaching grammar. So these are key questions if we're thinking about what is the role of grammar in literacy teaching. And in some ways, I'd like to try and avoid too many oppositions and binaries. You can probably think of reasons why any one of those might be useful at particular points in the teaching of language. It's not necessarily that there's a right answer, that there may be times when if you can identify the terminology, it means you've got a language to use to talk about language. If students understand the structure of their own and other languages, it can make learning languages easier because you can make those comparisons. It's not, when I'm talking all the time about mistakes, I'm not suggesting that mistakes don't matter. And sometimes grammar can help with the avoidance of particular mistakes. But the one that I'm most interested in, and which follows on that tradition from Halliday, is that understanding how text and language work in communicating meaning, where the grammar and the meaning come together. So if I'm thinking about how do we change and reframe that debate about grammar teaching, I think there are certain things that I'd like to get out and onto the table right from the start. The first is that teaching learners what a noun is, or helping them distinguish between a subordinate clause, or indeed to name or label any other form of speech, won't make them better writers. It's actually helping them to simply name things, but unless you do something with that knowledge on its own won't make them better writers. Teaching learners that they should use certain grammatical constructions, and this refers very much to the English curriculum, such as fronted adverbials or a passive, won't make them better writers. So we've got a situation, a strange situation, where certain grammatical constructions are required in the writing of 11-year-olds. And so I'm seeing very strange lessons where teachers are saying to children, yes, that's a really nice story, but can you go back and see if you can put in a passive? And students immediately go back and they put in a passive without any sense of why or to what purpose. So it's a sort of redundant, rather formulaic approach to writing. Teaching learners about discrete grammatical knowledge won't make them better writers. So really thinking here about that, just learning about the meta-language isn't enough if we really want it to be transformative in thinking about how children learn. But my argument isn't, therefore, that there's no point teaching grammar. I think there really is great value in knowing about grammar and indeed knowing that meta-language, and that it can be usable knowledge. I think that from a learning point of view, that idea of usable knowledge is important, which helps readers and writers understand the way texts are working, the way texts are constructed, and that therefore you've got a real potential here for using grammar knowledge as a resource for crafting and creating and shaping meaning in texts. If they have that awareness of how texts are constructed and shaped and the choices that writers make, you're opening up to those students the possibilities of using that when they craft and shape their own texts. So if we move to that notion of rethinking grammar, which was the title of today's lecture, there are certain principles I want to work through that lead to where we stand in our pedagogical approach at Exeter. The first is this idea of implicit and explicit knowledge of grammar, something which is totally confused in our own curriculum. It moves constantly between children being able to show they can use something in their writing and children being able to label it and can't quite distinguish between the two. So the first thing to notice, and this is as native language speakers, is all native language speakers have got a massive amount of grammar knowledge. They couldn't even speak a sentence or make an utterance if they didn't. But it's not explicit. It's implicit knowledge. So 3-year-old children, or even 2 to 3-year-old children who are just learning the language, in English there's a real tendency for children to use the past tense, ed, on irregular verbs. So they will make an error, like he goed into town. But it's a sign of what they know. Implicitly, they know how to form the past tense of regular verbs in English. Now, no 3-year-old, no matter how clever, in England has ever said, oh, I'm using the past tense of ed as the past tense on regular verbs here. It's just part of their natural language use. And likewise, as a native speaker of English, we know about adjectival order without ever knowing the rules that govern adjectival order. We can just do it. So if I said she bought a red big handbag, any native speaker of English, and probably everybody else as well, will know that you just never say a red big handbag. It has to be a big red handbag. But why? So that notion that actually children don't come into the classroom with no grammar knowledge. They come in with a massive grammar knowledge. It's just not explicit knowledge. And of course, explicit knowledge can be verbalized. And because it's verbalized, it means you can use it. It's accessible for discussion, both discussion from the teacher talking to students, but also peer-to-peer teaching. And it's also open to scrutiny, because you can discuss it. So a child who can say that is a passive actually is verbalizing something that the teacher can then use in the classroom for learning knowledge. So that idea of being able to identify that a noun is explicit grammar knowledge. But of course, that doesn't make children any better at using nouns, because they've already been using nouns ever since they started speaking. In fact, you can't really construct much speech without nouns. And the first nouns most people use are mama and dada. So nouns are there right from the start. So the explicit grammar knowledge has to be applied to a meaningful context. So not just the naming of it. So a child who can say that is a passive does have explicit knowledge. But if the child can say that's a passive, I've used it to foreground that information here, it's much more productive and creative knowledge. And that's where you're bringing together the focus on a grammatical term or a grammatical construction and its meaning and how it creates meaning in a particular context. Because, of course, a passive won't always foreground information. It might be doing something else. So for us, in our pedagogical approach, we see explicit knowledge as learning knowledge. And that notion of it being learning knowledge is really important, I think, for the classroom. So it can be used in the classroom for all sorts of learning purposes, like solving problems around language use, talking with each other about different language constructions and what they mean and how they may make meaning in particular contexts. And so it's a teaching tool that is important. So the explicit knowledge is usable knowledge. And then moving to think about, oh, that's come up in the wrong order, functional grammar, drawing on Halliday. The key thing about functional grammar is that I think it breaks completely that disconnect between form and its function in language use by bringing them together. So it shows grammar as a meaning-making resource and describes grammatical categories by what they mean. Now, I know Peter is speaking later on today. He may well use grammatical terminology that's taken directly from Halliday and from systemic functional linguistics. Because our own curriculum uses the standard forms of grammar, we use that terminology. But for me, the terminology is less important than what it's being used for. Is it being used to promote that thinking about making meaning? And that changes the way we think about grammar. And I think that's the transformation or the rethinking that I'm most interested in. So if we adopt a functionally oriented approach to grammar, then we're looking at that focus on the meaning. And we're saying that how we write something is as important as what we write. It's the idea about the message and the medium. It's not just the message, because the message is shaped by the language medium you're using to talk about it. So then if we move to this notion of grammar as choice, we like the idea of grammar as choice, partly because it gets you away from the idea that grammar is all about you must do this. And we like the way it just opens up grammar in a way that I think is much more creative. Carter and McCarthy, two English linguists, talk about the way we should think about grammar in two ways. Grammar as structure, which is what we're most familiar with, is ways of describing what language is doing and giving it metalinguistic names. And grammar as choice, which is opening up this idea that every time we speak or write, we are actually making choices. A lot of those are implicit, but actually if we can make them explicit, they become useful to us. Halliday talked about grammar being a network of interrelated, meaningful choices. And Adam Lefstein, so these are all coming from different traditions, talks about the point of grammar study being to enable people to make choices from among a range of linguistic resources and to be aware of the effects of different choices on the rhetorical power of their writing. So again, for us, showing learners the grammatical choices writers make and the grammatical choices they can make as writers can enable them to have more conscious control. So that notion of knowing you're doing it, of how the writing communicates their intended message. So we've had those three principles there, really. That idea of explicit knowledge being verbalizable and usable, the idea of a functionally oriented approach which brings together grammar and meaning, and this idea of exploring choice and different people's choices. Because I've been talking for a while, I'm now going to just give you a little activity to do that will partly explore this idea. So here we've got the opening from a children's book in England, Skellig, which won a lot of awards. And this is the opening paragraph. You've got the opening two paragraphs. You've got the first paragraph, and then you've got the first two sentences of the second paragraph. I'll just read the first paragraph because it kind of gets you into the narrative. But then what I want you to do, just in pairs or threes where you're sitting, is just think about what might go in those two brackets. And the brackets give you a bit of a sense of the space that it takes up, because they do represent the text. So I found him in the garage on a Sunday afternoon. It was the day after we moved into Falconer Road. The winter was ending. Mum had said we'd be moving just in time for the spring. Nobody else was there, just me. The others were inside the house with Dr. Death, worrying about the baby. He was lying in there, and over to you to talk about fill the gap. Okay, if I can stop you now. It's always a good sign when you can't stop people talking. Now, if you were to talk to others around the room about what you've chosen to put in there, there'd be an enormous variety of things that could fit into that slot. And in some ways, that's the key point, that, you know, all the time, there are choices about what we choose to do. I'm going to show you what David Armand chose to do, not to tell you the right answer, but to tell you his answer. So what he put in were a series of prepositional phrases. He was lying in there, in the darkness, behind the tea chests, in the dust and dirt. Again, very quickly, because I've got lots of these little things where I'd like to have a bit of discussion time, but I'm also aware of the time. I would like to have a very quick chat about why do you think he chose those prepositional phrases? Bear in mind that all we know about the he is the him. In that first phrase, I found him. And where did he find him? In the garage. And we know nothing else yet about who the he is. So what does this description suggest about that character that we're only just beginning to meet? So why those prepositional phrases? Okay, so it's a very quick chat. Just 1 minute. Okay. Now, there's a range of things you could have said, but you might have talked about, perhaps it suggests that he's been rejected, or he's unwanted, or he's unloved, or he's been lost, or he's hiding. All of those things it could have been, because it's darkness, he's behind something, and he's in the dust and the dirt. Certainly not a glamorous creature. Now, if you changed it, so if you alter the noun phrases in those prepositional phrases, he was lying there in a silken shawl with golden beading along the tasseled edges. Do you see how it alters? How, as a reader, we start to infer about the character. Character is the character in the book, Skellig. It sets the reader up for different expectations of what that character is going to be like. And that is really an exemplification of that sense of the power of the choices we make. So again, in a classroom, the discussion would be around, well, what changes? What difference do those choices make between the two versions? And why would the writer's purpose be different in each of those? So that children see that writing is not just about purple prose and vivid description, but it's all for a purpose, and it links to your intentions as a writer and the relationship you're trying to establish with your reader. So what we're really talking about is going meta here. Meta-linguistic understanding is kind of the concept underpinning what we're talking about through all of that idea of explicitness, about verbalizability, about the power of choices, and about meaning and form becoming together. Metalinguistic understanding is about looking at language, not just using language. So it's looking at language and being able to talk about it. And it's also about the moment when you suddenly shift from almost seeing through the language, because you're just communicating through it, to noticing the language itself. Now, for second language learners, that often happens when they get a sense of, hang on, is this right? Is this correct? Or something that they notice. So for me, because I did that little bit in Swedish at the beginning and had to work a bit with Google Translate to work out, and I got it wrong. I had to get somebody to correct it for me this morning. I had the tense wrong on lyssnara. I noticed a sign in the metro that used one of the constructions that was the same that was in that my introduction. I would never have noticed that if I hadn't been trying to do that. So I developed a kind of alertness to something that surfaced, and I noticed it because of what I'd been doing previously. And it actually, the whole thing about metalinguistic understanding is you're taking language as the object of observation. You're looking at it to see what it's doing. And we talk about it in two ways. One is the idea of language as an artifact, which is very much what you might call a linguistic way of thinking about language. But we're also very interested in this idea of the thinking and the manipulation of language that goes with it, which is a cognitive process, and the fact that writing happens in a social context, reading happens in a social context, and we have socially shared understandings about what good writing is. So that's the socio-cultural view. So in thinking about metalinguistic understanding, we're thinking of it from three perspectives: linguistic, cognitive, and socio-cultural. And so putting it in more plain English, metalinguistic understanding is fundamentally about classrooms where you'd see learners, whether they're first or second language learners, whether they're primary, secondary, or adult learners, thinking about language use, reflecting on language use, and discussing how it's used. So that going meta is a big thing for us. And then also just thinking about that terminology again. Sometimes it's the terminology that's the bugbear for those who are anti-grammar. The grammatical terminology is a meta-language. It's a specialist vocabulary for talking about language. It's possible that in Sweden you don't ever have to make a defence of it. But in the UK you have to make a lot of defence of why you have to use terminology. Why can't you just talk about language without terminology? Well, you can talk about language without terminology, and in fact we have evidence that a lot of younger learners do that, and that the terminology becomes part of their way of thinking a bit later. But actually, if we think about other aspects of the language curriculum, let alone other aspects of the curriculum per se, specialist language is everywhere. So rhetoric, and I think rhetoric is quite an important aspect of teaching in Sweden. It's not terrifically used in England, but it's got its own specialist vocabulary. Literature study has its own specialist vocabulary, and media studies has its own specialist vocabulary. And you could argue that, ethos is part of the grammar of rhetoric, and that metaphor is part of the grammar of literature, and that connotation is part of the grammar of media studies. Certainly in England, we have no arguments about using specialist language in those other areas, but we do have arguments about terminology. Part of that draws from teachers' fears about their own knowledge of the grammatical terminology and their greater confidence with the other terminology. So there is an issue there around subject knowledge. But the thing about specialist vocabulary is that in general, it does enable you to have higher level discussions because you can use that meta-language in that particular domain. And so the use of meta-language therefore helps that metalinguistic thinking. So if we bring this together, what we do know from research in writing, the teaching of writing, is that metacognition, thinking about how we write, is a predictor of success in writing. And actually that's one aspect of research that has a very large body of research from different sources saying how important it is. So, and in fact there's quite a lot of talk about if we got children thinking more about writing than just writing, we might improve their writing. And metalinguistic understanding is part of metacognition. It's the subset of it that refers principally to the language use, whereas metacognition will also refer to things like the process of writing and how you self-regulate, how you manage the process of writing. So if we can create opportunities in the language classroom or literacy classroom for that kind of talk that facilitates metalinguistic understanding, we're likely to be strengthening and growing that meta understanding. And what this is doing in particular is supporting independence and autonomy. What we obviously want for learners is less dependence on us as teachers and more on how do we help the learners we're teaching to make choices and decisions that are informed by their understanding of how texts work. It's really hard to transmit knowledge. Children and adults will pick up what you say and will feed it back to you. But often when you look at how they're using it, they haven't really understood it. Whereas if you develop the meta side of it, the thinking about language use, you're much more likely to help them to become independent and autonomous. So back to those sort of green principles, the pedagogical importance of explicit teaching of grammar as a meaning-making resource is because it develops this metalinguistic knowledge of their own, that independence. So pulling together this section, if we think about this rethinking of grammar, what we're really getting at is that these 4 principles that I've gone through in those previous slides, that idea of learning knowledge, verbalizable knowledge that's available pedagogically for discussion, reflection, and thinking. A functionally oriented approach where you bring together grammar and meaning rather than separating them as separate things. That notion of choice and opening up awareness of the possibilities of choice in particular kinds of writing that you're working on with learners, and discussing how that choice relates to rhetorical intention, authorial intention, and the relationship with the reader. And that explicitness, all of this explicitness, working to develop metalinguistic understanding. So moving on to look at our own research and the pedagogy that we've developed from it. One of the things that we've done over quite a long period now is develop a fully theorized rationale for why we should teach grammar. So that earlier question of what's the place of grammar in a literacy curriculum, our argument is essentially the argument I've just presented. And we've developed a corresponding pedagogical model that takes those principles and puts them into practice. And we've conducted robust empirical studies to really look at how effective that is. And not just to make claims about, yes, it works, because I think that's too simplistic in the complexity of any learning environment, but to look at where does it work, what helps it to work, what are the barriers and the constraints of it working. So we have done quite a considerable amount of work on this over time, and I won't go through those, but that's really just to show that we've looked at this from the big kind of medical models of randomized controlled trials, right down to our most recent study where we followed, worked in 4 schools, following for 3 years classes of children to trace how they developed in their learning and what the relationship was between the development in their learning and the teachers' classroom practices. So what's the way in which how teachers shape what children learn. And it is interesting because in terms of really understanding how things are going on, I think that's provided us with our best evidence. But governments prefer the evidence of the big randomized controlled trials. And I just want to highlight there, our evidence isn't all positive. I'm not interested in kind of evangelical persuasion. I'm much more interested in how do we change how we think about things. And there are factors which support and hinder effective implementation, which I'll touch on as we go through. So our pedagogy is really about a creative relationship between grammar and writing. I try as often as I can to put the word creative and grammar near each other, because so often they are seen, the arguments about no grammar are always that it's anti-creativity. You have creativity at one end and grammar at the other end. In another aspect of my research, we're doing a lot of work with professional writers, working with teachers and helping teachers to think about themselves as writers. And the professional writers are always very pro-creativity, very pro, school hammers the creativity out of them as writers. And we've taken evidence from what they say to these teachers in workshop sessions and in one-to-one tutorials. And those writers who talk creativity do things like saying, did you know there should be a full stop there? And you need to alter those nouns. So they use, even though they talk creativity, they use the tools of language in a very critical way as well. So we're interested in this idea of explicit teaching of grammar that's relevant, looking at how choices shape meaning, and helping in texts that children read, and looking at how they can look at them in their own writing. And we framed this after several years of working around this, on what we call these LEAD principles. So LEAD is an acronym. links, examples, authentic texts and discussions, so that you should always be making connections, if you're talking about grammar, between grammar and something that it's doing in the language use. Teach the grammar through letting them see examples rather than lengthy grammatical explanations, which rarely help children to understand, or learners, not just children. Use authentic texts as the models for discussion, real-world texts that are out there, both fiction and non-fiction, and build in really good discussion. That's where you get that metalinguistic thinking happening. And I've got a classroom example. I always put classroom examples on the right-hand side. You'll be able to access this PowerPoint afterwards, so I won't go through that one by one. But if you think about the activity that you did earlier around those prepositional phrases, I have, in effect, exemplified very quickly how the pedagogy can work. It was an authentic text. It was from a children's book. I showed you the examples of the grammar, but didn't get bogged down in saying who knows what a prepositional phrase is, or can you spot a prepositional phrase. I set you up to discuss things, and I made a link between the grammar and the meaning being created. So if you're thinking about how do you lead developing writers, whether that's first or second language learners, what do you need to do? You need to develop a habit in yourselves, really, of noticing what's happening in language, being attentive to what's happening in language, creating opportunities for playfulness. That stands in distinction, I think, to the rather more exercise-driven, rule-bound ways of thinking about grammar, and play at both lexical and syntactical level. In fact, you could play at whole text level as well. Use discussion to promote that explicit talk, and use the grammatical terminology incidentally as part of your natural way of talking in the classroom. Because actually the way all words are best learnt is when they're used in context, and repeated encountering of a term helps you to learn that word. And then I just want to think a little bit about your own contexts. The approach is usable whether you're talking about students who are L1 or whether they're L2, second language learning, or learning Swedish as a foreign language. It works for different students, primary, secondary, adult education. So the principles, I think that's the value in having principles, the pedagogical principles are applicable across contexts. But what you would need to do is choose the texts that you're going to use as authentic models that match the interests and experience of the groups that you're teaching. So if you're working with adult learners, you won't use a children's book. Or you could do if they all liked it, but you might choose a text because you knew that that was one that they might read. And you choose the learning focus to match the learning needs of your teaching group. One problem with presenting is that I have to pin things down to particular texts. And that suggests that this is suitable for particular age groups. For everything I show you, you could find alternative texts at different levels to suit alternative learners. So they're generic across all learners. It's that sense of what do you want them to learn and what texts are best to exemplify it that are the key thinking. So I'm now going to go through the pedagogy in practice. And again, just here looking at the lead principles with examples table I had earlier showed you Charlotte's Web. And here again, you've got an example of a text that is very descriptive of a particular setting at a particular moment in the story. But the description is created through using a particular grammatical structure. And one way to really help learners think about this idea of choice and meaning is this idea that I used with you earlier of taking something out and inviting speculation. And what you invite speculation about varies. So last time I asked you what fills the gap. Here, I'm interested in if you were trying to paint this scene or film this scene, from the information you've got, what would it look like? What would the scene be? So you have a discussion about that. It is an authentic text, so there's the lead principles, and I'm inviting you to discuss. So that would be another lead principle. And then you look at the text itself and have the question now, if you were painting this scene, what would you include in your picture? And this scene is much more detailed, provides much more locational and visual detail about what's happening. So again, you've got authentic text and discussion. You've made a link because you're actually trying to make a connection for the learners between what that notion of visual description and setting a scene and what's happening in the text itself. And then you might show them that all those gaps on that earlier slide are, again, prepositional phrases. So you've got examples and links between the grammar and the effect that it creates. And again, you're not dwelling on explaining the grammar. You show the grammar, and you can see how I use highlighting and colour and bold to help make visual the structure that we're talking about. And then just to show that point about different text, this is a text for slightly older students that does a very similar thing with prepositional phrases for locational setting. And then for older students, or even young adults, the Lord of the Flies, William Golding's Lord of the Flies, does the same thing. So what you've got here is 3 different texts doing a very similar thing. So what you would be drawing out for the writers, the learners, is that one way, and it's always one way, not you should, but one way to establish a setting in narrative is to use prepositional phrases to create a strong visual description. So there are other ways that you can create a setting in narrative. It doesn't have to be that way, but it's one way. And if that was replayed then on the planning template, for planning, thinking about this, it would look like this. You've actually made sure that you've made that link, you've shown examples, it is an authentic text, and you think about where am I setting up the discussion activities. So if we move from fiction to argument and non-fiction, this is one of the things about school writing is sometimes school creates its own versions of what text should be that don't necessarily match with the real world, which is why it's really good to use authentic text. We use a lot of material from the World Wildlife Fund, and some of the things you're seeing here are from that. And of course, a lot of the material there is highly persuasive and creating an argument usually about why we should give money to support that activity. That's the action that's being required at the end of it. And they use all sorts of techniques to do it. But here, I've taken a text from the World Wildlife Fund in the line of fire as the argument, as the title. And I've slightly adapted the text. And if I can, I think I will just give you a minute to discuss this. It's shrunken from what it should be. I want you to just discuss, what is the implied argument here and what's being persuasive, but how might you strengthen it? How might you make this a more powerful argument? Okay, so just 1 minute, I'm afraid. Okay, I am going to move us on. I'm getting the warning signs on time. So here is the full version. It's more elaborated, and again, you could now discuss, well, how does this version make its argument? And it's making an emotional argument. It's really going for the pathos side of arguing, and it's amazing how many of these campaign material type texts begin with something that hooks the reader emotionally before coming in with a rational argument and then the actual appeal for money. And if you were to look at it talks about the bloody mess where her tusks have been brutally hacked from her face. So real, and then the description of a tiny trunk. And what it's doing is using noun phrases here to create that sense of emotion. And you could go through and look in detail later at each and how it expands from that bare text that I gave you first of all. So the learning point for writers in this one would be, one way to develop an argument is to use extended noun phrases to create an emotional appeal through the detail conveyed. And again, you can see it laid out on the planning template, looking at different examples and authentic texts. I'm moving on. I'm just showing you this to show you it is an authentic text, because I know you can't read it, but this comes from, again, a World Wildlife Fund technical report And this is the bit that I was going to get you to look at. This is a much harder text, so either for adult learners who are really developing or for older students. But in this one, you might again look at what happens in that text in terms of scientific or specific language. In England, we do a lot of teaching of topic-specific nouns for a subject, and you see classrooms covered in them, but very little about the collocations are needed for a subject like temperate grassland, and less about noun phrases that typically occur when you're writing about this. You know, small mammal populations, the effect of conversion. So how can we think more about moving beyond just the nouns to the way the noun phrases are working as nominalizations of key packages of information? But you could also look at a text like this that's quite sophisticated in terms of the way tense is used. So it uses the present tense, as a lot of scientific texts do, to convey that sense of universal truth. It uses the past tense, so it's talking about a particular narrative fact about something that's happened. And the use of passive voice foregrounds attention to the point being made and not to the people who did it. So again, you can explore the text in that way. And just to look at the way in which that's with a sophisticated text written for adults, you can look at this in a text written for younger children and find similar things happening there. So actually, this is an Australian book that I bought when I visited Australia. You find here topic-specific nouns and noun phrases. And then you've got the universal present tense again. So these things can be addressed to learners' needs, whatever their ages are. So you might have, as a choice, one way to convey information is to use the present tense to indicate a general universal truth and the past tense for a particular narrative fact. So you're teaching how to manage that, and there would be the lead planning template for how to use that. So just to finish then, I'm coming back to where I started, well, not where I started, where I got to in the middle, really, with that argument about rethinking grammar. This is what we're trying to promote, is that explicit verbalizable use of grammar as learning knowledge, where you connect it to meaning and meaning-making through opening up choices, and in that way, you develop metalinguistic understanding. And if you did want any further resources to look at, there are various resources there that you could look at. So thank you.